Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. My name is Chris Weuve, not speaking for my employer, and you're watching Starfleet Tactical. Thank you very much, everybody who's here. I had said in the title to this one that we might have a guest. We are not going to have a guest. That's because my friend Andy Presby, who thought he was going to be available tonight, it turns out he's not going to be available tonight. He's spending some time with his wife, which is a good thing. I'd like to have her come on the show too, and we'll see if that all works out at some point in the future. But in any event, so this is going to be a question and answer session. So if I got fuzzy there for a second or jittery or something, I just got some notification there was a network. Well, it's happening again. There's a network issue again. There's not really anything I can do about that. So I'm just going to press ahead and hope it doesn't become a total issue. But if you've got questions and stuff, so put them in the chat. I'm going to answer some questions. And in addition to that, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few things, including the fact that it's Pearl Harbor Day in the U.S. here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some stuff about Pearl Harbor. So I seem to be having a network issue that keeps coming and going on the StreamYard side of things. So if somebody... Oh, Paul says the internet's been under attack all day. Okay, so is it affecting you guys? Is it affecting... Delon says a network issue appears to be on my end. The funny thing is that I'm seeing it in StreamYard. I'm not seeing it on my laptop. My laptop says I've got a good connection, but on StreamYard it pops up something. So I don't know what's going on there. Okay, all right. Delon says the network, the broadcast seems good. So, all right, I'm just going to assume it's good, and I'm going to keep going. So, a few announcements, as always. So, as usual, anything that is new or different might have changed. I put in italics here. 21 December, I all of a sudden realized I had just forgotten that 21 December existed. For the last 2 months, I've been giving you a schedule that didn't have 21 December on it. I expect to be here 21 December. So plan on a show next week. I'm hoping that next week's show will be Chris Carlson. There's an outside possibility that there won't be a show next week. I've been invited to a Christmas party, but the Christmas party is a long distance away, specifically Atlanta. And I don't expect I'm going to be able to make it. But there's an outside possibility, but expect that probably next week, Chris Carlson will be on and we'll finish talking about the Mike Bosworth stuff. That's specifically going to be Deck Combatants. So think battle writers. Think battle writers, except U.S. Navy battle writers. The idea that you can carry something, a deployable craft around in the well deck. And for those who've been watching the show for a while, this should give you flashbacks to the French torpedo cruiser Foudre that had the torpedo boats on the back and things like that. So that's kind of the lineage that we're talking about here. And then I don't know what I'm going to do the week after that, but going forward in the future, here's some of the topics I've got immediately queued up. There's some other potential ones in the chat before we got started. Paul mentioned albedo, and I want to do a show on albedo, specifically on ship design and albedo and combat in albedo. Albedo anthropomorphic, specifically the Irma Feldna EDF part of the Albedo Anthropomorphics graphic novel series. That's a very, very interesting ship design thing. It's modular construction. It is not like LCS type modular where you can sort of routine change stuff around. It's more like the MECO stuff that the Germans did, where they use modules in the construction process, and you've got sort of standardized things. And I love albedo. I absolutely love it. It's a furry thing. I just sort of ignore the fact that I'm dealing with furries. I really like the technology involved, etc. And so this is what the schedule looks like going forward through the end of February. So, as always, any images I put up are intended for critical evaluation. I'll try to comment on them in the process, and they remain the belonging to whoever owns the copyright on them. Like, for instance, this image, which is a wonderful image from the original Battlestar Galactica, sort of pre-production art, and I really wish they had done that. That would have been absolutely fantastic. So I've got 3 things on the agenda. Don't have very many slides tonight. The first one is just, it's the end of the year, and I've been thinking about where I want to go with the channel and stuff. We've been talking about moving the time. So just sort of a brief discussion about all those sorts of issues. So we'll talk about that for a little bit. There's an interesting ship that's in the news. It's a Qatari naval vessel that just got delivered from an Italian manufacturer. And so I want to just take a really quick look at that. And then I want to talk a little bit about Pearl Harbor and some of the implications of Pearl Harbor. And then any questions you might have at the end. And so before I do that, I should say that last week or week before, I was at a science fiction convention. Week before that. The week before Thanksgiving, actually, I was at a science fiction convention, saw Bob Haranek in person. We were actually trying to figure out where we had first met. If you would have asked me before that conversation, I would have told you it was at one of 2 cons. And when we were talking, I said, well, I met you at this con or that con. And he said, I've never been to those cons. And so we kind of concluded it had to have been PhilCon the last time I was at PhilCon, which was like 8 years ago, which was an answer that really, really surprised me because I didn't think it was PhilCon. I thought it was one of these other cons, but it must have been PhilCon. But I had a good conversation with him, did an updated version of my 2-hour version of Aircraft Carriers in Space. And so you guys have seen all the stuff in it in bits and pieces, but at some point I'm going to make some more changes to it because I'm improving that version of the presentation, and then I will do it again on the show. Because I found that it's useful to sort of go back to topics again, because for a couple of reasons. One is that it's always good to have a refresher, right? It's always good to have a refresher. The second reason is my thinking on stuff changes over time. So I have conversations, I learn stuff, I think about it some more, I go, oh, I should have put this in there. This is an important point that I wasn't thinking of before. Now I need to add that into it. And as I research stuff, as I think about stuff, my view of things changes, and I try to make the graphics better too. And so I think of new ways to put it together. Sometimes it's just the slides get better because for instance, I've done the 2-hour version of Aircraft Carriers in Space twice now, and once at PhilCon and once at Origins back in June. And I sat down the Friday of PhilCon and rewrote the second part of that presentation. I basically totally rewrote it because I realized I had a much better way to organize it that sort of broke it down better. And so that required creating some new slides and pulling some new graphics down and sort of, changing the old slides to fit in with the new slides and stuff like that. And so I think it's much better than it was before. And so I'll do that at some point. It's going to be at least 3 episodes, maybe 4, when I do the sort of the long version of it. And hopefully I'll have somebody on board who can comment on it and make it even better again. And so that's one of the reasons why I redo these things. And also the other thing is I'm really kind of lazy about putting together things like playlists and stuff like that for the channel. I need to do that going forward. I need to do a better job about doing playlists and just doing general channel cleanup. And after I do an episode, I should go back and change the keywords, and I should go back and change the description, etc., so to make it easier to find. And so that's one of the things I haven't been doing that. So revisiting old material is a way for people who are new to the channel. I don't want this to turn into one of those things where somebody comes and goes, well, I'm so far behind, there's no point in me even trying to do stuff, because he keeps referring to all this stuff that I just don't understand because he did it previously, right? And I don't have a good set of basics that I can point people to, so I have to kind of keep bringing the basics up again. And it gives me an opportunity for you guys to ask me questions and for me to make it all better. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick little look at what's going on in the comments and see if there's anything I want to Cosmo Flanker says, have you seen the new Qatari LPD Alfouk? I'm going to talk about that. That's specifically the ship I'm talking about. I've got a slide on that. Could the Aegis radar differentiate between different types of World War II Japanese planes if it was in Pearl Harbor on Battleship Row? Between the different types, probably no. It would just call them low, slow flyers for a lot of those fighter bombers because they weren't very fast. So it might have been able to differentiate just based upon, maybe based on speed, maybe based on size of the target, but I probably not. So I should emphasize, I'm not an air defense guy. I was an ASW guy. So I can tell you about submarines. I can't tell you nearly as much about the air defense side of things. Okay, looking through this. Steve Galacci is the Albedo author. Yes, indeed he is. Dustin, can you reword that question? I don't quite understand it. Logic's Finest says Italians make beautiful designs. They have zero mechanical reliability or longevity. I don't know enough about the Italian naval side of things to know if that's true on the naval side of things. And I don't know, over what time periods that's true. I have no idea if Fincantieri, whatever the name of that company is. I've never had to pronounce it before. I don't know how to pronounce it. I have no idea if they do good work or not. They seem to have a good reputation, but I don't know that. I don't know that for sure. Are AI speedboats coming to the U.S. Navy to protect larger ships in places like the Straits of Hormuz? Unclear. The problem with speedboats is they're really susceptible to wave action and the like. And so, a protected waters make that better. I don't have enough understanding of the Straits to know if that's useful for there. And also, they don't have a whole lot of range. So my guess is that the short answer is no. Because in a lot of instances, the best rule of thumb I can give you about small boat stuff like that is when you're thinking about would it be good to do a small boat thing, either manned or unmanned, ask yourself the question, am I better off using a helicopter? And about 7 times out of 10, the answer is, yeah, you're better off using a helicopter. It's more responsive, it's faster, it's got better, height, so it's got better field of view. It's not susceptible to the wave action. There's a lot of reasons why helicopters are just superior. This is the same reason why, radar carrying blimps are really cool. Radar blimps to do ASW is a really cool idea. I love that idea. I absolutely love that idea. And you should not do it. You should use a helicopter instead. And I am no more happy about that answer than you guys are. I think it would be wonderful to have giant blimps hunting submarines, but it just doesn't make any sense. When in a world where helicopters exist, it doesn't make any sense to do it that way. Okay. How many Starfleet Ares class ships showed up at Axanar to help USS Enterprise and USS Constitution? I have no idea. That is an Alec Peters level question. I have no idea. Let's see. A flagship of a small group of ships may be the largest ship where the commander decides to locate. Yeah, and we made a specific effort. We had destroyer leaders, and the idea was a destroyer leader was a larger ship that had the extra space to have the command and control stuff, including the staff, to lead destroyers. So it was an extra large destroyer, cost more money, but it gave you the command and control capabilities, including the bodies necessary to run your destroyers. And so it's frequently the case that the reason why, it's not that it's the biggest, baddest ship, it's because you need to add something onto a ship that's already there. Ships are usually operating at least somewhere near the margins, unless there's something else that causes them to be the size that they are. Aircraft carriers are kind of an exception. I'll come back to that in a second. So if you need to add a lot of excess capacity, excess capability and capacity, you generally need to have a bigger ship in order to do it. So if you wanted something that has all the capabilities of a destroyer, but also has the space for a command staff, you need to have something bigger. I said that aircraft carriers are kind of the exception, and that's because you may recall, and you'll see this again when I do the aircraft carrier talk, you may recall that the driver on the size of the aircraft carrier is the flight deck and the hangar bay and the large engines necessary to move that flight deck and hangar bay through the water at a high rate of speed. And just the fact that you need a big ship so that it's tall enough to get the flight deck out of the surface effect, out of the turbulent air down by the surface, because airplanes don't like turbulent air, especially when they're taking off and landing. And you want it to be as stable as possible. So you need a big, heavy ship that's stable. And when you add all that stuff, in order for it to be a good airport, it needs to be big. Well, since I have to make it big anyway, let's throw a whole bunch of stuff on it. And so that's how it ends up with all the command and control capability. It's being designed for something other than the number of bodies it can have on board and just the number of weapon systems it can have on board. It's being designed around that runway. And as a result of that, it has some excess capacity. So you don't have to make an aircraft carrier any bigger to have a command staff on board. You do for other things. I've seen a command staff go on board a DDG. They were kind of pressing it. It was getting a little hard. It was made easier by the fact that they weren't doing the air warfare component of that. They were only doing the ASW component, basically. And so as a result of that, that made it easier. They didn't have to, because they weren't dealing with Aegis. There's a limited Aegis capability. On Ticonderoga class cruiser has twice as many displays, twice as many places to sit. So you can have 2 displays and 2 sitting positions dedicated to the ship. And then the second 2 displays and the 2 positions are dedicated to the air warfare commander. So the air warfare commander is on board a Ticonderoga class cruiser, usually. And so, but that's because they expected him to be there. And so they built a little excess capacity in there. And he's also the ship's CO. And so he doesn't have a whole lot of extra staff on board for that particular mission. Okay. All right. Okay. One Horse Shay said, does the Miranda class replace the Ares class? Unclear. Miranda, Ares, I think, was kind of a one-trick pony. It was really designed as a warship, and it was a perfectly fine warship. But after the war, when they got back to sort of the exploration mission, I'm not sure it had a whole lot of excess capacity for exploration. Let's see. All right. I may come back to this, but let me go ahead and go to the next slide, which is the channel going forward. So first of all, I have no plans to go anywhere. This is not me getting ready to make some big announcement about, changing things. I'm here to make a small announcement about changing things. It's almost guaranteed that starting in January, we're going to go to 9 p.m. Eastern time, still on Saturdays, but 9 p.m. Eastern time. That really seems to work better. The vast majority of you said it doesn't matter for you. 1 or 2 people said it's a little harder, but they can make it work. The people that generally expressed a preference said, yeah, that would work better. It works better for me. It works better when I have Alec on. It works better for all of the guests I would have on, with one exception. It's a little bit worse for him, but he hasn't been on the show yet anyway, so we'll try to make it work. I probably won't go any earlier than 9 o'clock, because 9 o'clock is 8 o'clock Central Time. And a large number of the guests who come on the show, when Pat Doyle is here to help me co-host, when Chris Carlson is on, I still want to have John Parshall on. They're all Central Time Zone people. And I occasionally do things in the Central Time Zone, do the show from the Central Time Zone. And so, that takes it to 8 o'clock. If you go much earlier, you run into a situation where if somebody wants to go out to eat on Saturday night, they have to rush back home in order to do the show. And I don't want to do that to anybody. So it's probably going to go no earlier than 9 o'clock. As much as Alec would like it to go to like 7, it's not going to go to 7. Going forward in the future, I've sort of settled into what I call the alternating battle rhythm. So my fandom superpowers that I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. That's basically what this show is about. And so I've kind of recently fallen into an explicit battle rhythm. I sort of found myself doing it, and I'm trying to intentionally do it, where I'll do a show or a set of shows that are basically talking about real world Navy stuff, and then I'll try to put a science fiction spin on it. And then I explicitly am going to try to do shows that are science fiction navies, and then I'll put like a real world spin on it. So somebody made the comment to me, like, you know that your show is supposed to be a science fiction show, right? Because they had stumbled into one of the LCS things, and it's like, you keep talking about LCS, where's the science fiction in that? Well, it's okay. So yeah, fair enough. But I mean, like I said, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. And so I try to do that. And so I'm going to try to more explicitly alternate. And one of the ways I'm going to do that, so I'm going to talk about Traveler, I'm going to talk about 2300, I'm going to talk about Albedo. I want to start doing book reviews, specifically focusing on sort of like the combat systems and stuff. Like, for instance, Michael McCollum's Antares series has some very interesting things in it that I specifically want to talk about, like specific solutions to specific operational problems that they had. They came up with specialized ships to deal with certain things. His Gibraltar Earth series has a very interesting strategic situation in it. And there's a couple of places where he has characters do stuff that I thought was strategically insane, and we'll talk about that. And, you know, I want to do the Exordium series. I want to do a read along that, but I've decided that I'm not going to do that until I get Sea Powers done, the game I'm doing for Chris Carlson and Larry Bond. I need to get at least some work on that done. And so before I open the time suck that will be Exordium, because I fully expect that I'll get sucked right back into that series and want to work on the game I did in that universe and stuff like that. So that's my sort of thinking on topics and stuff like that. I've got a long list of topics, and I'm sort of consolidating my notes, and that's one of the end of year things I need to do, is consolidate my notes and sort of get all those sort of random pieces of paper all put together in the same computer system. I've been talking with a friend of mine about being a regular co-host once a month, my friend Merle Robinson. He says he's up for doing it, but he's been busy. He's also going to come and talk about technology that should have broken Star Trek. I'm looking forward to that talk. I also want to start doing guest interviews. I haven't done those yet, in large part because they all fit in the category of I need to read one or more books first. So like, I want to have Walter Hunt on the show to talk about his Dark Wing series, but there are 4 books in the series, not including the unpublished prequel that I've read and offered comments on about 2/3 of it. So, you know, I haven't read those books in 15 plus years. I need to reread them before I have Walter on the show and we talk about it. I don't want this to be just a general, hey, tell me about your book. I wanted this to be an in-depth discussion of the tactics and stuff involved. And so I need to reread John Parshall's book before I have him on. And there's some other people I want to have on that have, you know, Chuck Gannon, for instance. I've talked with a bunch of people that are willing to be, Tom Mays and Sword Into Darkness. They're all willing to be on the show. I got work I need to do in order to make that happen. And I want to do some watch along. So I've sort of upgraded my capability to just sort of sit and watch an episode of Star Trek each night, or I want to do Space Above and Beyond also in particular, because I think there might be some crunchy goodness there that's sort of hidden in there, and so I want to pull that out. And so that's the plan going forward. I want to do all these things. So I'm not going anywhere. The show's going to stick around for a while. Okay, next on the list is the Alfolk, this Qatari amphibious transport dock. Now, I'm going to take me out of this and just go big picture while I'm talking about this one. It is a ballistic missile defense amphibious transport dock. I never thought I would say all those words in the same sentence like that. but it specifically has missiles that are capable of doing ballistic missile defense. Doesn't have very many of them. It's got 16 launchers, 2 8-cell vertical launch system launchers that are surrounded by that maroon ellipse on the top photo. Now, it's not the white thing. It's the thing right below the white thing. You can see that there are hatches there. 2 8-cell launchers forward on the starboard side of the vessel. That's the weirdest thing ever. This thing is about the size of an Arleigh Burke. It's a little bit shorter, but in terms of its displacement, it's about that size. It's got a flight deck forward and aft. I mean, this is just weird. It's just weird. I haven't quite seen anything like it. So it's got a sister ship. One other navy, the Algerians, have a couple of ships that are in basically an earlier version of this. This was ordered in 2016. It was launched in 2023, but it's in the news because it was just delivered. And so this is something. This is the sort of thing that I think would fit in real well in a science fiction background, the equivalent of this, right? The space-going equivalent of this. This is the sort of thing that would fit in well in a situation where you've got small numbers of forces and you need to sort of show the flag and have tiny bits of capability that go along with you. The equivalent of the Corvette transport from Starship Troopers. I put the Danish Absalon class in the same category. That German frigate that's like the world's largest frigate. I think they consider this thing to be the combat equivalent of a frigate also. And, you know, with 16 missiles, that's about right. That's kind of frigatey. It got like the combat capability of a frigate, but this thing also carries the Alpha carries 440 troops. The Absalon can carry like armored vehicles and stuff like that. So you sort of add these other capabilities in, and it looks really, really interesting as the sort of thing that you know you send out, that frontier fleet sends out to deal with a local disturbance or something like that. This isn't the sort of thing that you use to fight in the battle line. This is the sort of thing that you use to go out and do a presence mission and provide some support to the flotilla as the flotilla is doing its mission. Remember back when I talk about Corbett and he talks about the battle line, the battle force that's going to go fight the big battles, the cruiser force, which cruiser in this case is a job description, not a ship type. The cruiser force is the one that protects trade and threatens enemies' trade, maintains the sea lines of communication. And then you've got the flotilla that's basically the inshore force, the close to shore force that does sort of the workaday stuff of minefields and patrol and, you know, stuff like that. And the purpose of the battle force is kind of to back up that flotilla force, which is sort of doing all the heavy lifting, the unsung maintenance guys. You know, it's the equivalent of the street sweepers of the naval world. The battle force is there to protect those guys and to go schwack the enemy battle line if the enemy battle line comes out and, you know, enemy battleships try to threaten these guys, right? So this is the sort of thing that you have, that you send out to sort of like guard the minesweeper when it's doing its thing, and it's got enough capability that it can do a wide variety of things without having to call for backup. Now, 440 troops, why do I need that? Well, okay, so I'm kind of telling you the science fiction version of it. In the science fiction version of it, having a couple hundred troops available to drop on a planet is probably a useful thing. You know, especially if this sort of implies to me that it's hard to get to places, that it takes a long period of time to get to places. If I can just call up on my interstellar radio and say, hey, send a battleship, and the battleship shows up 12 hours later, I don't need something that looks like this. Now, why did the Qataris build it? I think this is because they're trying to beef up their navy. They're a small navy. They don't have a whole lot of resources to go. You know, they're not gonna they're not going to buy like an Aegis cruiser. They're just not going to buy something that big. This gives them a little bit of capability in a lot of ways, and it lets them do missions like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. If they needed to put troops ashore to evacuate an embassy, they could do something like that. This gives them a lot of little capability that might be useful. Just enough capability to be useful in some situations, which is funny because, like I said, it's sort of a frigate class in that regard. And the joke about frigates are ships that have just enough capability to be bad in all areas, right? A frigate, if you got the option of calling something beefier, you don't call the frigate. The frigate is like, oh my God, I wish I had a frigate here. But frigates do have a little bit of capability in all areas, and they can be useful, even if you wish you had more capability. So I'm looking forward to see how the Qataris use this thing. It's got pretty decent range, 7,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. It's got, carries a crew of 600 if you include the soldiers in there. It's got an ESA radar. It can shoot down ballistic missiles. This thing kind of, I like it. It's ugly as sin, but I like it. Okay, let me see if there's anything that anybody said here. Okay, let me make my chat window a little bigger. Rolling back. Let's see. Logic's Finest said something about helicopters being ungodly loud. They are generally ungodly loud, although I noticed that it's worth noting that the chop, 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 chop that gave them the nickname choppers back in the Vietnam War, that's something that you can affect with the shape of the blades. They're quieter than they used to be, but it's still a jet engine, and it's still very, very loud. Even if the blades aren't loud, the rest of it's loud. But that having been said, apparently we built some stealth helicopters, and we still use them occasionally, as Osama bin Laden found out. Dustin said something about Starfleet being so short-sighted that Starfleet prematurely retired all the Ares-class ships when they should have been used in Starfleet police duties. I'm not sure Starfleet had any police duties at that point, and I suspect that they were mothballed, not retired. And so for a while there, it was probably the case that if the balloon had gone up, you would have seen Ares-class popping out. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that the impression I get from the original series is that was a time of great technological improvement in the Federation. And so in a lot of ways, it's sort of like 50s aircraft, right? It wasn't unusual for the U.S. Navy to buy a whole bunch of new airplanes, or the Air Force for that matter, either service, buy a whole bunch of new airplanes. They'd buy like a fleet of 600 airplanes and use them for 5 years, then give them to the reserves and stop using them. And that's because the technology was changing so fast that they became obsolete that fast. And not just obsolete in terms of combat capabilities, but in terms of like flyability. Some of those airplanes, especially some planes that the Navy flew, were incredibly dangerous. They lost a lot to accidents. Part of it was just inherent aerodynamics. Part of it was that the engines were unreliable, et cetera, et cetera. So you really kind of wanted to get rid of that stuff as fast as possible. I don't think that there was anything particularly bad about the Ares class, but I think it was kind of a one-trick pony, and it wouldn't surprise me that they didn't retire them for the same reason that NX-01 got retired, right? It was a fantastic ship for its time. Its time was 20 years ago. And so you saw that with airplanes all the time. The idea that you'd have an airplane that would just hang around for 20 or 30 years, that really didn't start until things like the F4. You really had to kind of get to the late 50s or like effectively 1960 before you started having airplanes that were good enough to bother keeping. And I think that may be true with things like the Ares class. The technology just got so much better. And remember, small differences in warp capability lead to large differences in speed. And so it's not, a warp 4.5 ship versus a warp 4.7 ship. That's a bigger difference than it sounds like it is. Let's see. Dustin asked about Skydance buying Paramount, and I have no idea. I have no idea. Okay. Okay, scrolling. Stephen Ross says, would amphibious transport docks be under ballistic missile threat? Possibly. I mean, the Houthis are shooting at anything on that floats. So it's possibly the case that they'd be under an anti-ship ballistic missile threat. I don't think we're not talking about ICBMs here. We're talking about other types of ballistic missiles. But I think the other thing is that if they have a ballistic missile threat that they need to, if there is a ballistic missile threat and they want to counter it, this is a ship that could do it. So you would send the ships to do that specific mission. So the Gulf is relatively small, so it's not like Qatar is trying to cover the entire, Indian Ocean, the entire Pacific, etc. So for where they're at, it's like, hey, this is the ship we got, so we'll send it. Paul says for Americans, frigates are smaller than destroyers. However, for some European navies, a frigate is larger than a destroyer, more a light cruiser. I do not believe that is the case. I think it is the case that frigates have been getting bigger over time. And so when you compare things from different time periods, that may be the case. But one of the reasons why the 1975 U.S. Navy reclassification happened was explicitly because all of our European allies viewed the frigate as being something that was smaller than a destroyer, and we had the frigate as being something that was in between a destroyer and a cruiser. And so we changed our nomenclature to match everybody else's. Now, that having been said, you always run into the situation of do people use it the way that it's intended? What's the rule of thumb in a given navy? You see this in the Honor Harrington series. Manticore has destroyers that are twice as big as the Havenite destroyers, and it's because Manticore views destroyer as a mission. Haven views destroyer as a size classification. And so the Manticoreans say it's doing the mission of a destroyer, so I'm going to call it a destroyer, even though it's like the size of a light cruiser. Compared to how Haven does it. And so you run into that all the time. Ships have been getting bigger over time. And so like it used to be a 3,000-ton destroyer would be incredibly large. Nowadays, 3,000 tons is a frigate. It's not a destroyer at all. It's a frigate. And you have 8,000-ton destroyers, which were the size of cruisers in World War II. Light cruisers, anyway, small stuff. So it's weird how this all works. Let's see. I don't know that this would be a useful ship for the Canadian Coast Guard. Yep. And I'd have to think about whether it'd be useful for the Canadian Navy. Let's see. Yeah, Paul says the ship is under greater threat to Chinese silkworm anti-ship missiles than it is to ballistic missiles. Yeah, silkworms are an easy threat. It's a big, relatively slow subsonic missile, even though there's multiple variations on the silkworm. But a silkworm is basically that's the Chinese variant of the it's the SS-1 missile, and I can't remember the Styx. It's the Chinese variant of the Styx. Now, it's changed over time. It just like Scud is sort of Scud is a family of missiles. So Styx is kind of a family of missiles, and a silkworm is not the exact same as a Styx, but it is kind of a big, slow missile. So, relatively speaking. Okay, so now Olive, I have effectively caught up. And so I'm done talking about this. Let's talk about Pearl Harbor. Okay, so A few myths about Pearl Harbor that are worth dispelling, and you may remember that this is stuff that I pulled directly off of the Aircraft Carriers in Space slide. So Pearl Harbor was the demise of the battleship. No, battleships hung around for a long time afterwards. They hung around during the war. We repaired most of the battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor. In fact, the battleships at Pearl Harbor. Hold on a second. Let me go back for a second. Let me go back to here. I forgot to point out this citation here. This by David Fukia, I think is how you pronounce his name. Task Force 1, the Wasted Assets of the United States Pacific Battleship Fleet, 1942. That's an excellent article if you can get your hands on it. I reread it every couple of years, and it basically talks about what they did with the battleships in 1942. And one of the things they did with the battleships is, they patched up the ones that they could patch up at Pearl Harbor, and they did the ones that they could get back in service as fast as they could first, and then they sent them off to the West Coast for more extensive repairs. And part of the deal with those more extensive repairs was a complete modernization. Now, some of those ships, the Colorados had 16-inch guns. The earlier ones had 14-inch guns. But that 16-inch gun, the gun that we later saw in the Iowas was a variation of that. They were able to up-armor some of those ships, and they had been up-armored in the interwar period. So you can't change the placement of the armor, but you can add additional armor. Not the most efficient way to get armor, so it's not as good as if you had designed it that way to begin with, but you can up-armor stuff, and you can increase splinter protection, etc. And indeed, those old slow battleships had armor that in general terms was at least as good as the fast battleships that came later. Most of those fast battleships in most places. Now, it had a few quirks here and there, and it lacked the 5-inch, what was it, a 5-inch 30? 5-inch 30? I forget the caliber of that gun, the barrel length of that gun. But it lacked that gun. That was a dual-purpose gun for surface action. It was also useful for anti-air stuff. It was a phenomenal anti-air gun. They didn't have those until later, but it did allow them to do an upgrade to those battleships, and so they came out of the yard way better than they had been before the attack. And that happened relatively fast. Some of those ships were heading back to Pearl Harbor, like in second quarter of 1942. Some of those ships were like heading back to Pearl Harbor like in April and May and stuff like that. So they did a quick turn on what they could, because a lot of it was, you take a torpedo hit, you settle into the mud, you have to sort of patch it, you pump it out, you get the machinery working again, and then you send it off, and then you fix the hull for good when you're on the West Coast. And so you very quickly ended up with a fleet that could actually, the U.S. Navy had some beef again at Pearl Harbor, but why didn't they use it? Well, the answer was mostly about fuel. Now, the United States at this point produced something like 60% of the oil in the world. The issue was not that the United States lacked fuel. What the United States lacked was tankers in the Pacific. We had lots of tankers. They were all in the Atlantic, making sure that the Brits, who had no natural oil supply, were able to have oil. And so most of the tanker fleet was busy keeping the Brits in the war. Nimitz didn't have a whole lot of tankers in the Pacific, and while tankers are relatively easy to build, it took a while. Early 1942, it took 1942 to build up the tanker force. So early on, he gets these battleships back, and he not only does not have, you know what, let's turn off that banner. Sorry about that. Not only does he not have enough fuel to run the battleships and the carriers at the same time, he doesn't really have enough fuel to use the battleships instead of the carriers. Because the battleships used a lot more fuel than the carriers did. Even with the air wing, right? The air wing uses a tremendous amount of gasoline. But even with the air wing, the carriers used a lot less. And so it basically was, that's what they prioritized. They prioritized the carriers at that point. And the other thing is that the battleships were really kind of viewed as the last resort weapon. You didn't risk a battleship if you didn't need to. You didn't absolutely have to. And the places where they did risk them, they were pretty desperate. I mean, this idea of sending South Dakota and Washington into the waters of Guadalcanal at night was like a real act of desperation. It worked out for us, but it was because we didn't have anything else. And so we did what we did. Consistently before the war and during the war, the quote unquote expendable major ship, the one you sent in to do routine, seriously dangerous stuff, was the cruiser. And so it was really a cruiser war for a big chunk of it. You brought out the battleships if you absolutely positively needed to risk them. You didn't want to risk them. Now, Fukuya does not talk about something that I think is essential to understand all this, and that is the fact that everybody, the US and the Japanese, knew what the US build plan was. And early on, the Japanese had a superiority in battleships. But we knew that at some point it was going to become equality. And then later on, it was going to become US superiority. So early on, there's no incentive for the US to fight, because why would you fight if you're inferior? In the middle time period, when they're equal, there was no incentive for the US to fight, because if we just hold on a little bit longer, we'll have superior forces. And then by the time the end of the war came about, the last half of the war, now we've got superior battleship forces over the Japanese, and there's no incentive for them to fight, except when it got really desperate, at which point you saw Musashi and Yamato come out and do, their death rides, right? And so that actually hints at the real issue that made carriers superior to battleships. It wasn't the ability to take damage. It wasn't the ability to inflict damage. It was the range at which you could inflict damage. Battleships it was hard to force an engagement with a battleship because the range of the guns was so low, 25 nautical miles tops, right? So it's tough to force an engagement. Now, that's an interesting thing to run through the science fiction converter, isn't it? Right? What range of a weapon do you need to be able to force? How do you force it in a science fiction series? Well, you'll see when we get around to doing the Exordium series, they may, Dave Trowbridge and Sherwood Smith, this was Dave because it's a Dave kind of thing, specifically talk about how you don't have battles in deep space unless both sides have an incentive to fight. So generally what you have to do is you have to threaten infrastructure, or you have to put somebody in a situation where they think they can win, and then you have to beat them. Because the way those drives work, anybody who decides, hey, I'm peacing out, time to leave, they just leave. And there's nothing you can do to stop them. And so we see that in the Honorverse. When Honor gets captured, David Weber has to work really, really hard to create a situation where Honor can't get to the hyperlimit, where the Havenites can force a battle and as a result force her to surrender. That's a big deal. So in Star Trek, it's kind of hard to tell. In general, I think you can actually force somebody. If you've got a speed advantage, you can force them. If you've got the right weapons, i.e. photon torpedoes, you can at least plink at them. And there's that one scene in Deep Space Nine where Nog is in control of a runabout, I think, and he's under attack. And they're trying to run away, and they're slower than the people they're trying to run away from. And he finally just says, I'm going to drop out of warp and turn around and attack. And Jake says, that's insane. They outgun us. And he says, yeah, but they outgun us. What we're doing isn't working. They outgun us this way too. At least if I turn around and attack, I've got more capability and maybe we can make something happen. So, okay. Second myth is the hidebound Navy refused to acknowledge the superiority of CVs. Now, this was a time of great technological and doctrinal change. And so, yeah, there were some people who thought it was never going to happen, but Mark Campbell in his master's thesis does a really pretty good job of, he makes a pretty persuasive argument that the U.S. Navy writ large understood that aircraft carriers were the wave of the future, and that the argument wasn't if aircraft carriers were going to take over as the primary striking arm. It was when. Are we there yet? Halsey thought that we were. Now, Halsey was a naval aviator, and by that I mean, in order to be a carrier admiral, he qualified in naval aviation. He soloed as an 06. So he came to flight school really, really late. He soloed as an 06, and I have never heard any indication that after he soloed that he ever got climbed into a cockpit again. I think he checked the box because he knew that that was the wave of the future. And he had plenty of opportunities to take. He served on battleships. He was a battleship guy. Spruance was a battleship guy. And they both understood that carriers were important, and most of the Navy understood that carriers were important and were the wave of the future. The question was, are we there yet? And, you know, the Japanese, one of the reasons why we were not particularly worried about the sort of attack that ended up happening is because nobody had demonstrated the ability. Nobody had demonstrated the ability to do a large-scale multi-carrier attack like the Japanese did. The Japanese finally figured out how to do that and how to, created the tactics, techniques, and procedures necessary to make that happen. It's in September of 1941 is when they convinced themselves that they could do it. And they didn't show it until the rest of the world until early December of 1941. And so this is a time period where there's lots of questions about what the exact capability is. Everybody kind of knew where the vector arrow was. The question is, are we there yet? So third thing, aircraft carriers won the war. They were certainly very important, but there was a lot of instances where battleships conducted shore bombardment. The battleships protected the aircraft carriers. The fast battleships protected the aircraft carriers. And so, yeah, I mean, aircraft carriers were essential, but they weren't the only essential ship. You could make the argument that submarines won the war. Make the argument that the atomic bomb won the war, right? So I think it's important to sort of understand the role that all the different ships had rather than look at it in terms of the solution. So lack of battleship action showed battleships were irrelevant. No, I already kind of went through all that. It had to do with what the correlation of forces were. And we stopped building them, not so much because they weren't relevant, because we used them all throughout the war, right? We didn't use them in 42, but later on in the war, they were all active all the time. We stopped building them because we had enough of them. And the idea that, there was sort of a deterrent on battleship actions because they couldn't force the action. And so if you didn't want to fight, you didn't fight. That doesn't mean that they're irrelevant. If the other guy's running from your weapon system, that doesn't mean your weapon system's irrelevant. Just in the same way, we've never used the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force, but that doesn't mean the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force is irrelevant. So I said already that early on it was really about the fuel, and that there wasn't enough for the BBs instead of the CVs, let alone in addition to. Later on, it was really more about the mission because they didn't consider them expendable warships. They considered them the thing that they held in reserve and they used when they absolutely had to, or when they had a good enough target. If you were going to send something in harm's way, you sent a cruiser. That's the thing that you did. So that's it for the slides. Let me take a look at what's going on in here in the chat. if you got any more questions, etc. Let's see. Paul says the UH-1 Iroquois doesn't fly. It beats the air into submission. Yeah, I think there's some truth there. Stephen Ross says, I don't think the Ares class would be compatible with vertical warp core technology. Quite possibly true. I'm not sure that, I don't think there's anything magical about vertical warp core technology. I think it really has to do with what's the best way to fit a warp core in a ship in a way that you can get the power to where it needs to go. Because, you know, you've got artificial gravity, verticals, whatever direction you say it is, but you've got limitations on what the hull shape is. Cosmos Flanker says rewatched Tora last night. I haven't seen that movie in forever. I need to do that. Paul says, shout out to my dad, fireman second class aboard the USS South Dakota. So for the record, I think South Dakota kind of got a raw deal. Let me rephrase that. In order to understand South Dakota's, the issues with South Dakota in the battle of, that I call Washington versus Hiroshima versus South Dakota. You know, South Dakota didn't cover herself in glory in that battle. It's important to remember that South Dakota had just had her shakedown cruise. She had never fired her guns at night before, if I remember correctly. Washington had only done it like 3 times. But South Dakota had never fired her guns at night before. She was a brand new ship with a new-ish crew that was just getting used to working together. So basically, as her graduation exercise, she got to fight a major night action against a very competent and determined foe. And there were a few issues. Okay, that happens. That happens. But I don't blame South Dakota for that. I think that is just one of those things that happens, right? Because the exigencies of the situation required that South Dakota be in the slot fighting that battle. And so that's where she was. And, you know, there were a lot of lessons learned that came out of that. And she took enough damage that she ended up going right back to the West Coast to have the damage repair. So I think that's, so yay for the South Dakota. Go South Dakota. Okay. Pearl Harbor was the lesson on radar that the U.S. Navy needed to learn. There's a lot of truth to that. One of the things that's important to understand about that radar situation where the radar detected the incoming airplanes. Excuse me. I've got a cough drop in my mouth. I'm just finishing it off. That radar was an experimental set. That radar was only on a certain number of hours a day because they were basically trying to figure out what it could do. They were training their guys, etc. It wasn't really part of the defenses yet. Everybody knew radar was going to be important, but they were just kind of getting up to speed on it. And so they just happened to have it on, and they just happened to spot those airplanes. And they knew that there were some airplanes coming in from the coast. And so it's like, okay, if you hear hoofbeats, you should think horses, not zebras. Turns out this time it was zebras. But that doesn't mean that the rule of thumb that you should think horses isn't the right rule of thumb. You should think horses because it's usually going to be horses. So they didn't really have radar procedures and stuff like that at the time. So they were just sort of getting up to speed on that. So people look at it and go, how could they be so careless? And the answer is they really weren't being careless. This is a footnote to history that isn't usually interpreted the right way. It's important to understand exactly what that radar was all about. Okay, let's see. Talking about reconstructing West Virginia and yeah, being a slow BB-48, slow South Dakota class. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. So what happened to the battle cruiser in U.S. Navy prior to Pearl Harbor? We didn't build any. We had a couple that we were in the process of building called Saratoga and Lexington when the Washington Naval Treaty came into existence. And part of what ended up happening in the Washington Naval Treaty is they froze new construction of battle cruisers. And as part of the deal, we negotiated them away. And I don't know the exact details of why we didn't insist on being able to build them, but we didn't insist on being able to build them. I believe what we did is we got special dispensation to turn them into aircraft carriers in a way that didn't count. The counting rule was, there was an exception to the counting rule that worked in our favor. And so we got more aircraft carrier capability because we said, we're going to convert those into aircraft carriers. Now, as it turns out, Lexington and Saratoga were not as efficient of aircraft carriers. Like despite the fact that they were bigger ships, they had a smaller aircraft complement than the I can't think of the class of the carrier, but it's the one that Enterprise was one of. Enterprise had a bigger airplane complement than Saratoga and Lexington did. And despite the fact it was a smaller ship, and it's because, it was a conversion job. But as a result of that, we had a slow battle line and no battle cruisers. And if you go back and watch the shows I did on Trent Hone in the development of interwar naval tactics, so that led to a situation where we had a secret set of tactics where we were going to do something. Instead of doing this, we were going to do this and end up on opposite course. And we had a set of tactics designed to do that. And we had fake plans to, things that we would do to head fake the other guy out. Everybody assumed that we were going to fight like this. And so we had it all set up to go the other way. And that's because we knew that we didn't have battle cruisers to be on the vanguard and to cut across the other guy's line and force him to maneuver. And we didn't want them to do that to us. So we came up with this swanky plan. So we didn't have battle cruisers. U.S. Navy never had battle cruisers. Some people will point to the Alaska class as being a battle cruiser. It really wasn't. It was called a large cruiser, and it was really kind of intended to be used more like a large cruiser. And in one of the great ironies, it was there was a Japanese class that this thing was designed to counter because we thought the Japanese class was going to be of type X. It really wasn't planned to be of type X. It was planned to be something a lot less capable. But then we started building the Alaska class, and the Japanese said, oh my God, they're building this Alaska class. We need to beef up this thing to type X. And so we actually incentivized the Japanese to create the ship that we thought we were countering. Always entertaining when something like that happens. So Randall Wong says having much of the Pacific Fleet there at Pearl may have been a problem of not many berths open. I think they had you always can sort of park ships outboard of each other. They did that a lot in order to make that work. Pearl is not the largest anchorage in the world by any stretch of the imagination. It's a very good protected anchorage. It's not the largest. I didn't, from my time going into Pearl, I didn't feel like it was super cramped. But then again, I didn't see a whole lot of battleships there. There was only one, and that was USS Missouri. So I got to go into Pearl Harbor on the deck of a U.S. destroyer with a Japanese officer standing next to me as we passed Arizona and Missouri. That was an interesting experience. Let's see. Yeah, Pearl can take big aircraft carriers. Let's see. So what's my view on Zumwalt moving from the main gun platform to missile? Is it looking for a mission? Well, it's looking for a weapon. And so part of the problem was, they had a specific conceptualization for it. They decided not to build the 30 some that they were going to build. And as a result, with only a couple of guns per ship, they were never going to build the ammunition stockpile to make the ammunition cheap on a per round basis. And so they decided they couldn't afford to build the small number of rounds that they needed. They just couldn't afford to manufacture it. And so the end result was they canceled the gun. And so the destroyer has vertical launch tubes. So it's not like it's totally and completely unarmed, but it was built specifically for this gun to do naval gunfire support. And now, it doesn't have that capability. What it does have, though, is a pretty beefy radar and a lot of excess power generation capability, because planning for the future. And, people say things like, railgun and things like that. So they built a lot of excess power for that thing. And so in terms of the details of this hypersonic missile they're putting on it, to be honest, I haven't actually gone and looked through that, any sort of detail. And so I've been sort of vaguely aware of it, but I haven't been aware of it enough to have an opinion. I believe it is the case that the ships have a lot of inherent capability, and so they're potentially useful ships to have around and figure out something to do with them, right? This is the thing where if you've got a ship, if you've got a C-frame and it's got a lot of life in it, right? It's not old and tired. You figure out a way to use it. And so putting a big weapon system on it because it's a big ship makes a lot of sense from the standpoint that I'm not sure what else you could put it on. So that having been said, let me go do some research. Maybe I'll change my mind. Okay. Yeah, Yorktown class is the answer. Essex were later. Yorktown class is the one I'm looking for. Named after, wait for it, the USS Yorktown. USS Ranger was a small CV. They had some leftover mass, some leftover displacement they could use within the realm of the treaty. And so they said, hey, let's create a small aircraft carrier and see how that works. And the experiment was a success. They learned never to do that again. And so, a lot of people look at Ranger and say, well, Ranger was a failure. I don't look at it that way. I look at it as they decided that that it was worth their while to conduct the experiment. Let's go ahead and do it and see if it's useful. Turned out they learned that it wasn't. They learned that that's not the thing to do, which was a good thing. They learned that. So good for them. Good to the United States Navy for being experimental. Love that. I would rather have, Wright says, I would rather have completed Kentucky and Illinois than the three Alaskas, I think is what he meant to say in that sentence. Yeah, I agree from that standpoint. Now, that having been said, Kentucky and Illinois gave up their engineering plants to be used on some fast tanker support ships. So those plants did get used. And of course, the bow of Kentucky got used after Wisconsin had a collision and they had to cut her bow off. So they took the bow off of the partially completed Kentucky and put it on the Wisconsin, which is why the nickname of the Wisconsin is the Whiskey, because it's part Wisconsin, part Kentucky. Let's see. The Philippines are begging the U.S. to open their bases there again. Well, when you're in a bad neighborhood, sometimes you want the cops around. How much of a danger would the battleship Yamato have been had she not been sunk? Yamato was really a pretty nifty ship. I've got some books on the Yamato, and I've been sort of looking at the engineering of it and stuff, and there's a lot of really nifty things on that ship. Yamato was a seriously capable ship. And so it took a lot of effort to put her down. And, the Japanese sort of had nothing to lose. The Japanese have an interesting view of the world. The Navy at the end of the war thought it was very important that they find a place for the fleet to go to die, unquote. And so they had a set of plans that were basically designed as the suicide runs, the death runs. And the question of which death run they would do would depend upon what the U.S. did. And so, a ship determined to not back down, that's got 18-inch guns, okay, not the best gun in the world, but, still 18-inch guns. Still a lot of good engineering in that ship. There was nothing really wrong with that ship. It could have been a big deal. It could have been a big deal, which is why we wanted to take it out as fast as we could. And so we put a lot of effort into putting those ships down. Let's see. Zumwalt is going to become a testbed ship since she is the only one of her class. I don't think that that's true, actually. I think there's still 3 of them in commission. I'm not positive about that, though. I know they built 3. The question is, I don't know what they're doing with the other 2. Zumwalt's the only one you hear about, right? The others are Michael Mansour, and I forget what the 3rd one is. So I need to pull a thread on the Zumwalt class. Now, at one point in my life, I was a professor at the United States Naval War College, and one of my students at the War College, a guy named Scott Tate, later was the CO of the Zumwalt. I have not talked to Scott since I left the War College. Well, actually, I haven't talked to Scott since he left the War College because he graduated before I left. But I'd love to look him up and say, tell me about the Zumwalt. In fact, if I had known that I didn't find out he was CO of the Zumwalt until after he stopped being CO of the Zumwalt. If I had known that he was CO of the Zumwalt, I would have said, I will drive to wherever you are. Let me have a tour. I was going to do that with Phil Purnell's ship HSV-2 Swift. And the only reason we had it like mostly planned that he was going to be in a specific place. The ship was going to be in a specific place and I was going to go there and do a tour. And then Hurricane Katrina happened and they got Hurricane Katrina? No, Haiti earthquake. There was an earthquake in Haiti. And they got sent down to do HADR stuff, and I never got a tour of Swift. And now Swift, of course, was trashed. Swift stopped being a naval vessel, was turned back over to whoever the Navy leased it from. It got turned back into, I don't think it got turned back into a car ferry like it was before. It got used for something else, and it ended up getting hit by an anti-ship missile. And so, yeah, it had a bad day. And so you can see pictures of it. Chris Carlson has actually done an analysis of the warhead. He said, you look at it, you can tell that it's an explosively formed penetrator warhead because you can see the places where the little explosive formed discs. It's sort of like peppered the front of the ship. It's not one big hole; it's a bunch of smaller holes. And he said, yeah, that's a telltale sign that it was this kind of warhead. And he's even got a picture of the warhead. Let's see. Yeah, no one wants to be killed by a shell with more mass than a minivan. Yep, I would agree with that. I'm surprised American Ego didn't drive them to build a 20-inch gun armed battleship just to one-up the Japanese. Maybe eventually it would have. The 16-inch 50 on the Iowa class was a really, really good gun. It was a really good gun. Had really good ballistic performance. The super heavy projectiles had really good performance. Now, some people would argue that the 16-inch 45 on the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas were better in certain circumstances. The shell wasn't quite as heavy, and it didn't fire to the same extreme range, but at its maximum range, it had a steeper angle of attack, and as a result, it had better penetration than the guns on Iowa did at their extreme range. And there's some particulars in how that all works. And so now I will note for the record, I'm not a gunnery guy. I'm telling you something that I read. I'm not the guy who's going to do the math and figure out how all that works. But we had a particularly good gun. The 18-inch guns were okay, but the Japanese guns were not as good as the American guns as a general rule. It's sort of funny, all the different things that the different navies were good at. I've heard it said also that U.S. Navy armor didn't really improve between the world wars. That, you know, we might put it in place better, right? You know, maybe I'm not saying the design of where we put it wasn't improved, but in terms of the quality of the metallurgy, it didn't really get any better. British armor, on the other hand, the British armor got better in between the world wars. And so World War I, U.S. armor and British armor on an inch per inch basis was effectively the same. By the time World War II came around, the Brits had some improvements on us. We had a particularly good gun and we had a particularly good shell for the gun. And of course, the Brits, there are times in the Royal Navy's history when the Royal Navy's had problems with shells. So from that standpoint, I think we had a leg up on them. The Japanese weren't known for the guns. They just weren't. Japanese metallurgy occasionally had some issues as well. So sort of would be interesting to see if they all got together and contributed the part that they knew about, right? Would love to see that. Sort of like the Havenites and the Manticorans getting together. Cosmo Flanker said the U.S. didn't know Yamato had 18-inch guns until after the war. Not sure exactly when we figured it out. That might very well be the case, that it wasn't until after the war. I want to say that we figured it out during the war, but I could be wrong on that. Could be totally wrong on that. Paul points out we made 16-inch nuclear shells. Yes, we did. Yes, we did. I don't think that I can't remember how many nuclear shells we made. I can't remember if we made enough to actually say that we could deploy them. I just don't remember. Okay. All right. So we're at the hour and 17-minute mark. And so I think it's probably time to declare victory. And so once again, as always, I would like to thank you all there's 30-some people currently online. And so thank you very much for coming and spending your Saturday night listening to me ramble. I am constantly in awe of the fact that there's not, you know, that I get anybody watching this, right? At least live. And so I really appreciate the fact that you all do that. And so with that in mind, thank you very much, everybody. I'll see you next week, and hopefully we'll have Chris Carlson on board. I think it's probably going to happen. So see you then, and have a good weekend.